Good morning, everyone. My name is Nogwanda Masego. I am a senior economist at TIPS. Welcome to our development dialogue on the African Growth and Opportunity Act. As you would have seen in the invitation and the document that was sent out, the report, essentially the point of this development dialogue is to, speak about the impact of AGOA and the possible renewal of the Growth Act and its implications for South Africa. I'm not going to spend too much time speaking about it. I think we all have a sense of, what's involved in the act, and we've got the report. And so by way of introduction, we're going to have 4 speakers. The first one is Dr. Saul Levin, who's going to be presenting part of the report from TIPS, which is South Africa in AGOA, Impact, Potential, and the Case for Renewal, which is a paper by TIPS and Cosatu. And then we're going to have Tanya van Mielis from Cosatu, who's going to provide us with insights from labor. And then from there, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Faisal Ismail from the School of Public Governance at UCT. I'll provide brief bios just now. The last speaker is going to provide insights from the DTIC, and that's going to be Malusi Letwalo. So briefly, the speakers' bios, I'm not going to speak about everything, but as you all know, Dr. Saul Levin is the Executive Director of TIPS. He has completed his PhD in Development Studies from the University of Johannesburg, and his PhD was on industrial financing. And then Tanya van Mielis is the Head of Public Policy and Labor Market Policy Coordinator at Cosatu. Faisal Ismail, Prof. Faisal Ismail is the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. And lastly, but let's see, okay, there we go. And then Mr. Malusi Letwalo currently serves as the Chief Director for bilateral trade relations at the DTIC. Sorry, colleagues. Who's got the aircon? It's piping hot. Sorry, like I'm sweating. Yes. Okay. So, in the interest of time, I'm just going to say speakers, as already agreed, we have 10 minutes. And for the audience, we are in between each presentation. We're going to take about 5 minutes, just two questions, just for clarity seeking. And then at the end of the 4 presentations, we're going to have proper question and answer session. So if you don't get to ask a question or make an input between the presentations, just keep it noted, and then we'll talk about it at the end of the presentations. So what I would like to do is, if in between the speakers, we can take 1 question from the room, and then if there's a question online, then take that one as well, just so that people online also get to participate. Okay, with that housekeeping in order, do we have the first presentation ready? So we can go ahead. Saul, please. Go ahead.
Okay, morning everyone. It should be me who's sweating, not you. I'm the one who's presenting. Okay, thanks everyone, and welcome to everyone online. Daphne, you're sharing it online as well. Okay, the full report is available on the TIPS website, and it was research that TIPS undertook with Cosatu and was completed earlier this year. We have our lead research on the project, Christopher Wood, who unfortunately can't make it. He's now based in the UK and is not able to present the work. So I'm going to go through the key issues that are raised in the report. Okay, great. Okay, so the report tries to undertake an analysis of what's happening with the AGOA, with the impact, some of the political economy issues, as well as some understanding of where the jobs are coming from. So I'm only got a few minutes. I'm not going to do everything, but you can read the full report. Moving to the next slide. Thanks. Okay. So what we can see with the report and with AGOA is that there's clear benefits from having AGOA, and these have been increasing over time. And what we try to look at in the report is not that it's just the direct AGOA benefits. There's lots of additional benefits by being part of AGOA. So when we do the analysis, we can see that there's products that are going through AGOA, but it's the broader trade benefits. There's jobs that are created, but it's the broader investment and enabling environment around that bilateral trade. So we've seen specifically for South Africa that our benefits directly through AGOA have been in agriculture and manufactured exports. And there's very specific products because of the way the tariff lines work. There's very specific products, and we detail that in the report, and I'll touch on some of it shortly. But things like wine, citrus, nuts, ice cream, we export a vast amount of ice cream to America under the tariff AGOA line, which I was not aware of until we did the research. And then certain chemicals. There's a whole lot of products that we export to the US that aren't part of AGOA, and I'll touch on that briefly as well. There's risks to the non-continuation of AGOA, just generally. It's a unilateral trade measure. It has to go through the various parts of the US government, Congress and Senate, and it expires next year. And there's been a lot of work starting last year, continuing into this year, to discuss and to talk about the renewal. There's also an election later this year that may or may not impact on it. But what we do see in our analysis is that by and large, AGOA has been bipartisan, which means both Democrats and Republicans have supported AGOA, obviously with different issues, but it has been something that's been a feature of both parties. It was started under Democrats, continued under Republican, and so whichever way it ends out later this year, we'll see that the measure is still strongly likely to continue. South Africa's role within that was an issue, and particularly last year when the bulk of the research was done, there were a few issues that were raised. But overall, we've seen that trade between South Africa and the US has been growing. And it's if you look at the last decade, and the report does look at that, so a lot of it is commodities, but it's also the products under AGOA. South Africa has been specifically able to take advantage of AGOA. So there's a lot of other African countries that aren't really benefiting it. So we see in our analysis, and I'll touch on it, there's 5 countries that have largely benefited from AGOA in Africa. South Africa is one of it, and specifically on the manufacturing side. So as a non-petroleum exporter, well, we do have some petroleum and petrochemical products, but through AGOA, we're not exporting oil to the US, which also fell into AGOA. So we not yet. Okay. We see that AGOA is also an important part of US trade policy. So even though it's unilateral, it's been a key feature, particularly in the absence of bilateral trade agreements or multilateral trade agreements, which South Africa started many years ago. Maybe Malusi can touch on some of that history, but there isn't a bilateral trade agreement. So AGOA does become a very important part of trade policy, but also how the US sees its role of trade rather than aid, and supporting economic upliftment through building capacity. We know that the benefits of AGOA haven't been fully utilized, and I'll talk to a bit of that. But very important, and we do flag this in the report, is that for countries that are exporting to the US, it's complicated. Sorry, countries and companies. So it is difficult, and we do need to think about how do we support companies and how do we partner in regional value chains with other countries to think about getting access to quite a competitive and not such an easy market to get into. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so in terms of the overall trend, so there's the detail is explained in the report. So what we can see, does this pointer no longer work? Or am I pointing in the wrong direction? Okay, that's fine. Okay, so what we can see is that over the last couple of years, obviously with COVID, there was a drop in everything during COVID, but the benefits more recently from AGOA, and if you add in GSP, it's around 25% of our exports. Part of that is because we do a lot of commodity exports, which aren't included in AGOA. But our argument in the paper is that these things are linked. You can't separate the two. The general good trade relationship is embedded. So that's why we see the growth over time and the benefits from both, people getting familiar with the US market. There's logistics, there's a relationship with suppliers. So it's important that we don't just look at the AGOA benefits in isolation. And that's quite a key message that we put into the report. Okay, our commodities go in, but they don't get the AGOA benefits, which I've mentioned. The last point there is that we see specifically when we take out agriculture and manufacturing, a lot of those products fall under the AGOA tariff lines. So for those if we take out the commodities, for those particular exports, AGOA is very important. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so there's different tariff benefits, and there's a lot of detail in that. We try to calculate the rand and dollar amount of the tariff benefits each year. And we can see that, obviously the dip in COVID, but we can see that the trend line is broadly growth and increasing in recent years. So as AGOA has continued, the longer it continues, the more people get familiar with it, the more they're able to sell into the US market and take advantage. So knowledge is built. I spoke about the complexity, but companies get familiar with the complexity. They build capacity. So these things are important about in-company learning around how to take advantage of these things. And colleagues and industry associations as well play a very important role in the companies being able to access and share information around how to access these markets. So we do some analysis looking at the value. So we total it up over 10 years. So in and of itself, $100 million is not very much for the US. So the benefits of AGOA in terms of the dollar amount. So it's a bit more for South Africa. We're a smaller economy. And when you put in the exchange rate, it looks good. But for the US, we do a fun fact. So it's negligible. I mean, it's 0. I don't even know how many noughts there. I think there's like 5 noughts there. So it's very negligible concession in terms of what the US government is giving up in terms of the tariffs lost. But it's important because it's part of the trade relationship, and it's part of building that that export and trade issues. And part of it is also the benefits in the US, which probably outstrip some of the tariffs foregone. So if we move to the next slide. So what we try to do here is what would happen if we didn't have AGOA? So part of it is not only the extra that you would pay if you were exporting, which, on the surface of it, you dilute it over lots of products, lots of years. It doesn't look that much. But for the individual companies trying to export into a competitive market, it adds a lot. So what we do is we try and come up with some analysis on what the costs of not being in AGOA would be, largely for the manufacturing sector, and then also a risk for the agricultural sector and agricultural exports. So that is explained in more detail and in the annex of the report. So what we see is that South Africa would be at risk of possibly losing these exports. They may not. They may continue. We don't know if there wasn't AGOA. These exports may still continue. But we can see that there could be a potential loss because now these products, even slightly more expensive, would face difficulties in getting into the US market. Next slide. Okay, we then try to quantify the jobs. Now, doing jobs analysis on something very specific like this is not easy. So there is a model that's explained in the report. But even again, it's not vast numbers of jobs that are direct jobs. So we look at on the SA side, the jobs in the different sectors. We look at the indirect jobs with an estimate. Then we look at the US jobs. So there's also jobs created in America because of AGOA. We try and quantify that using various reports and data sets. And then we look at the total trade of South Africa with US. So that's obviously bigger because there's commodities we're exporting that are then further processed in the US market. I do outline some of the critical minerals that we're exporting, and I'll touch on that now. And then the total AGOA from all the different countries that are part of AGOA. We put some figures in there in the report on that. So looking at the critical minerals. So one of the key things is South Africa does have lots of very good minerals that are needed. Okay, I'll try finish in time, but because I'm your boss, you may have to give me an extra 2 minutes. No. Okay, let me talk quickly then. So there are some very important minerals. Part of it is not only that South Africa is a dominant exporter of some of these minerals, so that they are featuring quite strongly as minerals that we're exporting to the US, but also where else would the US get these minerals from? Because some of the countries that produce these minerals are not countries that the US wants to trade with. So Russia or China, may have some of these same minerals, but wouldn't be countries that the US would necessarily want to start building strong trade relationships with. I mean, that can be debated, but there are issues around where they get these minerals from and the importance of these minerals. So South Africa being an important supplier of these minerals does mean that having this good trade relationship, which is emphasized by the continuation of AGOA and the collegiality of having that, that does become quite important. Next slide. Okay, so here we try and look at the different products, and given I don't have time, I'm not going to go into detail, but we do categorize the AGOA benefits and the non-AGOA benefits that go out as part of the exports. But we can see for some of these products, which is this line over here, the utilization of AGOA for certain product lines is really, really important because most of those products. So particularly on the agricultural side, we can see that. Next slide. Okay, so some of the risks around AGOA. So AGOA is, it's because of the way it's structured, it's difficult because it's a unilateral process. You could have staying in or being taken out as a threat, or could be misused or subject to lobbies. So because of the nature, it's not a thing where you come to negotiate. It's done by the US Congress, and then there'd be hearings for the out-of-cycle review, there'd be negotiations, but it's not as formal as a free trade agreement or a bilateral. So there aren't, biannual meetings or, things where you would talk through these issues. We've seen South Africa was subject to an out-of-cycle review quite soon after the last renewal, and then we saw Eswatini out and then they're back in. But there's definitely a process where it does raise a risk around how AGOA is structured. I mentioned the negotiating mechanisms, and I'm sure Malusi can talk about that more. We're more of a beneficiary for AGOA, but less so for other African countries, and particularly the non-oil exporters. And then there's a risk in that AGOA only significantly benefits 5, maybe 6 countries. So it's in addition to South Africa, it's Nigeria, which is largely oil, Ghana is mixed, Angola's oil and agriculture. Sorry, Kenya with a very strong agricultural focus, also some manufacturing, but Kenya have been able to do a lot of agricultural exports under AGOA, and we spell out that detail in the report. So without AGOA, will it impact on our preference to or access to the US market and our competitiveness there? And we still see a lot of commodities despite AGOA. So it's been beneficial in terms of manufacturing and agriculture, but we're still doing a lot of commodities. Next slide. The AGOA opportunities. I think there's been a lot of talk about a longer extension, which would support investment benefits. There's investment by US firms into South Africa and into Africa generally as a result of AGOA that can be part of the selling point, and it has been something that sees long-term benefits accruing to all African countries and the US, so all parties to it. There's regional growth opportunities, and we talk a lot about that report. So we've got the key anchor markets, South Africa plus the 4 other markets. Can we use those as nodal points to support regional value chains, to build on the existing knowledge of exporting into the US through AGOA and develop the regional value chains around that? So there's quite a bit of analysis on that in the report. And there's opportunity to expand and get into other additional line items under AGOA. And there are clear benefits to the USA from AGOA. So there's jobs, there's investment, there's the critical mineral access, there's growth in trade and services, which we touch on in the report, because a lot of that isn't always captured, but we can see that what is captured, there has been growth in trade, particularly as a US exporter to Africa and South Africa. Last slide, thanks for your indulgence, Chair. Okay, so some of my conclusions. AGOA has helped to improve South African exports to America. It's provided a platform to engage on trade issues in the absence of a trade agreement, and we have seen the overall trade growing. It's beneficial from jobs, investment, trade, and the trade and services. We've seen some taxes saved, we've seen jobs being created, and we've seen strategic value in a very competitive trade environment. It does impact on investment decisions. And also in a context where South African manufacturers are facing a lot of headwinds, to have a positive story around growing exports is something that is useful to support our manufacturing sector. It provides access to a market, but we know, and it's it's something that we all should know, that you can't just do trade policy. You have to do the industrial policy support measures so that you're given the opportunity, but you need the industrial policy to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. And we've had lots of dialogues on industrial policy, so I won't go into detail. And last point, there is still a strong imperative to keep South Africa in AGOA because of the development opportunities that it provides. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. Okay, so we're gonna take one question in the room and one online, if there's any. Is the question online? I think while we get to that question, I think one thing I would like to just put out to the room is, yes, we see the potential benefits, but I think looking at the utilization rate, especially in manufacturing compared to agriculture, agriculture has a far higher utilization rate. And so when you think about the potential benefits, does it actually make sense? I think is a question that I would like to ask. I mean, we know the US is going to need cars. So whether or not we have AGOA, cars are going to still be going to the US. Is it beneficial compared to some of the things that maybe we're having to give up? I think Prof. Ismail might maybe delve into that, but let's take the question at the back. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
There. Hi, I'm Lerato. I'm from the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. So thank you for that very point of clarity to say that AGOA isn't a trade policy with Africa or South Africa, that it's actually a platform to engage on trade issues. I wanted to ask you, do we have that quality of arrangement with any other else in the world? And then secondly, when you're saying that it's a platform to engage and not actually a formalized trade policy, it's something we discuss with Congress every, 1 to 5 years. Why do Southern African countries not try to lobby to get it more formalized then? Because it seems as though we can't really, there's very little to no room to negotiate certain terms of engagement with the United States from here.
Thanks, Lerato. Okay, so there's a lot to answer there, and I'm sure Malusi can also touch on some of it. So, the trade agreements that we have provide very formal negotiation processes, and then also ongoing bilateral engagements. So if we sign a trade agreement, for example, with the European Union, every, I think it's 2 years or maybe even more often, you have discussions. There's parts of the agreement that allow you to negotiate. You raise concerns, you can amend, and then there's trade-offs. So there's a lot that happens when you have a formal trade agreement. So that's a key difference. But negotiating, and South Africa did try to negotiate, and I think Faisal was part of that. I don't know if Malusi, you were in the department then, it was quite a few years back. And it was very, very complex. You know, South Africa is a small economy, has to throw a lot into a trade negotiation. Negotiating with a much, much bigger economy is difficult, complex, and it's fraught with all sorts of things that need to happen around that negotiation. So it was started, I think, maybe twice, and then it didn't continue for several reasons. So AGOA then provides a way for us to have trade relations, and positive trade relations is our argument. And so part of my response to Nokwanda's comment is that the trade relations, you know, it's a platform. And why using the word platform is that because it's not a bilateral trade agreement, but it allows us to build on the back of trying to get more exports into the US and to take advantage of that good relationship. In terms of manufacturing sector, yes, there's a lot more that can be done. We can expand to other line items, but it does require a lot of work, and it does require the industrial policy support measures to be able to access that trade thing. We do have lots of bilateral trade agreements. So with the EU, there's there's the TDCA, which then transformed into the EPA, which means that there are structured ways that we engage with other countries. So it's part of how we work. Malusi spends his life on the road because there's lots of trade negotiations and then ongoing engagements that I'm sure he can talk better to. I don't know if you want to answer now or...
Let's take it at the end. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Sol. Okay, I think we've seen some of the employment estimates, but I'm actually interested in hearing what Labour thinks of AGOA. So let's hear what Tanya has to say.
Thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak here. It's great to be able to engage. It's also great to be able to engage on a paper as Labour with a research institution, because it helps sharpen our thinking. From our side, it also gives you some practical knowledge of what's happening and how it's being used on the ground. So this type of partnership, long live, long live. There are a few things that I want to raise. The first one, and Saul had touched on it, is getting access to a market doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be industrial development. So with what we've got now, and certainly we can't lose AGOA, with what we've got now, how do we leverage it to promote further development? That's the key issue. The one thing that has proved very useful in increasing trade is working through value chains and working with some of the large multilaterals. And I'm going to give one or two small examples. Where, for example, Walmart, Massmart, has started procuring from South Africa. They've, because of the partnership with DTRC, they've gone into certain companies that are manufacturing something. They go, your product is good, but to really be able to access larger markets, both in South Africa and the region, but also the US, we suggest you change the following. And they give input on marketing and packaging, for example. They give input, they'll bring in industrial engineers and say, just redesign your factory. It'll have a huge impact on output. Now, those seem small things, but it's through these kind of relationships that businesses are able to access expertise that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. They're also able to see in detail what is needed to export into other markets. So something, even our own market, something as small as packaging. If you've got a person who really is an international expert on packaging coming and saying to you, change this, it'll have a bigger impact. Of course, it's hugely valuable. Of course, if you do that, you are going to sell more. But what we also then need to do is to find out how we address the non-tariff barriers. Because if we can address some of the non-tariff barriers, firstly, we can sell more product into the US, but secondly, it strengthens our industrial capacity as well. I want to give one small example of what could be done. A woman who is, she makes honey. So she collects raw honey from a variety of beekeepers all around the country. She processes it. She doesn't sell into the South African market. She sells to Europe. She wants to access the US market. Okay, so we're not talking about a company here without expertise. It's a successful exporter. It's been there for years. It only exports. But she says there's a rule in the US that says she has to own her own manufacturing facility. She can't contract to a third party to manufacture the honey. Even if the third party has got all the accreditations that are needed and can show that sanitary, phytosanitary, everything else has been adhered to. So her question was then, well, how can I get funding to access a company? That's the one issue. But the question that she should have been asking, that we would say, let's work on further, is, do you need to own your own facility to manufacture? Does it make economic sense for you as a business? Because you're going to be incurring a huge amount of costs as opposed to just contracting out to a third party. And is it really worth it? And it's not really worth it. So then we need to be able to go back to the US and say, this is a good example of a barrier that we can address. The only way that we can find exactly what to address is by companies trying to export. And we've got to give those companies a hope that they will be able to export, a sense that they will be able to export. So part of doing that then is strengthening relations with international buyers coming here and showing South African products and who supports it. So a good example was the AGOA forum that DTRC hosted last year. Had a wonderful exhibition and had products that were made in Africa, and buyers from the US were able to go around and have discussions. When I just sat in and listened to some of those discussions, they were discussing some of the technicalities that need to be solved. So it's both being able to get to the right people to sell your product, but also get to the right people to be able to overcome the regulatory hurdles or non-tariff barriers. Often in the discussion on AGOA, there's a discussion saying, okay, well, we've grown our manufacturing exports, which is great, and we must continue to grow manufacturing. And it's almost posed as should it be commodities or manufacturing? And the answer is it's got to be both. Agricultural exports to the US are a large creator of jobs. So the more we can export, the more jobs we have. The more we can grow our manufacturing base and export, the more we're growing jobs in the manufacturing sector. So it's not an either or. There is no trade-off to be made unless in the negotiation something comes specifically. The US does negotiate hard. So if one looks at what happened with chicken and the chicken subsidies, the US had wanted to close some access to South Africa because we had imposed anti-dumping duties on chicken coming from the US. The auto sector exports to the US were threatened. And government then made a deal so that the US would be able to export a certain quota to South Africa. I think the political dynamic and levels of relative strength have changed since then. Certainly in the geopolitical tension environment. So we have access to critical minerals that the US wants. We are another avenue for them to diversify where they're getting a range of inputs from. And I think we need to use that quite seriously. The other thing that I think we can increase our leverage on is the issue around jobs. So as many jobs are being created in South Africa and Africa through AGOA, a large number of jobs are being created in the US. That means for us as trade unions, there's room for us to work with our sister unions in the States to give a push for AGOA as well. So it's not just seen as a political imperative, a trade imperative from the US, but an imperative to help drive labor rights and employment through the world. And we need to work considerably more with our US counterparts on that. There are a few things that I still think we can challenge so that we can make better use of AGOA. The one is, how can we grow our services? At this point, we don't have a strong sense of what the barriers are to growing our service exports to the US. So I think going forward, we could be looking at that. Another area that potentially we could challenge is use of intellectual property. So the US is making significant money from us in terms of us using the RP, in terms of licensing. How, on some critical products that we need, are we able to get a relaxation of intellectual property rights? There have been circumstances, so for example, in pharmaceuticals, where RP has been relaxed. Can that be done more? The next, sorry, I know you're coming, but I want to put this as a key thing. So all the industrial policy stuff I agree with, I was going to talk on, we can't. But the one thing that I really think would be useful, and Malusi, I'm speaking directly to government, is to say, if we are to make better use of AGOA, is government not able to put up something like the one-stop shop you've got for investment? So if a person wants to export to America, they know there's one phone number they can call in South Africa, who will then say, okay, here are the tax experts you may need to speak to. Here are the health and regulatory experts you need to speak to. Here are financing experts you need to speak to. And if there's a problem in exporting, that the South African government would be able to work immediately with a counterpart in the US in a similar kind of setup to help unlock problems around exporting. That would be hugely important. And then I think with that, can we find ways to de-risk exporting to the US for a lot of the SMMEs that may be able to export, but at this point can't? Part of what could be done for them is using the exemptions in the Competition Act to work together to fill export orders, but they are still at high risk, and we need to find ways to address that. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thanks, Tanya. In the interest of time, colleagues, let's move on to the next presentation.
All right, great. So I'm aware that I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to be, I have to select what I say. So first, let me say thank you very much to TIPS for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join you at this discussion. As you know, it's one of my favorite topics. I spent about 18 months of my life working on this, on the renewal of AGOA, way back in 2014 and 2015. And we'll have to wait for another day for me to share that experience with you. So what I will do is, given the short time that I have, I'll say something about the current trends of AGOA over the last 20 years, because the United States itself has done an overview of the data. So I'll just selectively present a few pieces of data which could be useful for us. And secondly, I'll ask the question, what does the United States want from this arrangement, this investment and trade relationship with Africa? And then I'll use the time to make some recommendations about what I think should be the approach of the United States and what should we as Africa should be calling for. So the first point to make is that, and I think I agree entirely with the points made by Saul and by Tanya, and there are 3 points I would have made had I had more time and discuss in a little bit more detail. First is that AGOA is not free. It's not free. It has to be paid for. And indeed, we did pay for it. We did pay for it. And that's a long story, but some of the issues that Tanya talked about, the chicken and the beef and the pork, but also a number of policy proposals, policy issues we had to address in the negotiation were all things we had to pay for. Secondly, I have said this, and I've written a paper about this, reflecting on our experience, that AGOA, as it is structured at the moment, actually does the reverse of what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to help with strengthening partnerships, but it actually creates attrition. It creates attrition. And it's not just the South African experience, which is an exception. What's even more troubling is the experience the United States had with the East African community on secondhand clothing, where the US, in fact, retains a ban, or it has removed Rwanda from AGOA because Rwanda had a ban on secondhand clothing from the United States. So this has created attrition, which is unnecessary. So the third issue is that the US in the last AGOA, going up to 2025, has a very clear intention to transition the non-reciprocal nature of AGOA into a reciprocal arrangement. In other words, a free trade agreement. And they have started this discussion with Kenya. So that's the trend that AGOA is taking. Now, what does the data tell us? So the US, you'll find this on their the research office, or the US Congressional Research Office. It had a look at the last 20 years of trade between Africa or sub-Saharan Africa and the United States, and it's looked at the impact of AGOA. And what the US data says is that the total exports over the last 20 years on average results in less than 1% of imports into the United States under AGOA. So less than 1% of US imports are impacted by AGOA. The second thing is outside of oil. So there are several, about 6 or 7 countries like Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, that benefit from exports of oil, but that is really insignificant as far as preferences are concerned. So if you remove oil, what you find is that the main countries that benefit from AGOA are about 7. So only 7 countries, in addition to South Africa, export anything more than $100 million, excluding oil. So it's really a limited number of countries that have benefited in the last 20 years. And if you look at the case of apparel, if you look at the case of apparel, just 1% of Africa's exports into the United States is made up of apparel. Okay. Now, if you look at the case of what are the products over the last 20 years that have been exported by African countries into the United States, you'll see that actually the largest product, so the largest sector is textiles, but the largest product exported has been vehicles from South Africa. So that's the largest beneficiary. Now, if you look at the last 20 years and you see all the trade from sub-Saharan Africa into the United States, what you see is that textiles and apparel as a sector is the largest sector that does benefit. And as I told you, in the case of textiles, only 1% of total US imports of textiles comes from Africa. And as I said to you, the largest product from Africa outside of oil is automotives. Now, what's important about this is for sub-Saharan Africa, the apparel sector is very important, and AGOA is very important for the apparel sector because of all the countries we export our apparel to, the United States is the largest. So for our apparel exports, AGOA is very important. Now, this is an important trend. If you see the United States, you know, like all countries in the world, they have only a certain percentage of their trade which is has duties on it. Even in the case of South Africa, more than 50% of South Africa's trade is duty-free. Now, you see in the United States, that percentage of duty-free is very high, right? So it has been increasing. So you keep increasing the number of products. You don't charge anyone any duty because, you know, you don't have an interest in that. You're very competitive, or you don't produce anything. So the products that actually, the percentage of products that benefit from AGOA, you see it's a very small percentage of total imports into the US where there still are duties, right? For the rest of our trade, we don't need AGOA because it's either duty-free or the MFN rate is relatively small, or it's under the GSP. Now, why does the United States want Africa to trade with it? Why does it need Africa as a trading partner? And the US, in its current strategy, the Biden administration has written a number of documents and has made this very clear. The US, under the Biden administration, has increased its level of attention and focus to the African continent. Why? Because it has a number of strategic reasons for this. And as you can see, one of the main reasons for this is issues related to the critical minerals that Africa has, and which requires it to ensure that there is a higher level of governance on the African continent. And all of this relates to issues around climate change. So the climate change issues, governance, and critical minerals have become a very important issue for the United States. So in its own documents, so this is not me, I'm just summarizing what the US is saying. The US is saying that its priorities are to address the competition between itself and China. And in that context, Africa is a key player because Africa has about 30% of the vote in the United States. So that's very important for the United States. As you can see, also issues of the rule of law, conflict, and on the continent, that's very important. Critical minerals, high up on its list because 30% of the world's critical minerals are those minerals which are crucial for the current technologies that are needed for climate change and the fourth industrial revolution. And the United States is in competition with China on this and needs Africa. The US does have a number of programs. It has begun to increase the implementation of them, like Prosper Africa, Power Africa, Feed Africa. These are all US programs, and you can see in this last few years, they have paid more attention to that. They also are much more engaged, the Biden administration, on climate change, not just about critical minerals, but also about biodiversity and other issues. And Africa is very important. We have the second largest rainforest in the world here. The other one is in Brazil. So US strategy wants to elevate the relationship and the partnership. They are engaging with more African states. You've seen much more, senior leaders, the vice president and others, members of the cabinet coming and visiting Africa, even in South Africa, several of them have visited. They engaging, they're building civil society institutions, they will support for it. And the interesting thing for me, and I think for us here, is they have recognized that this, AGOA only is for sub-Saharan Africa, right? So when it was created in 2000, it was duty-free, quota-free, or preferences only for sub-Saharan African countries. And this practice of, dividing the African continent has been one which both the US and the EU have been engaging in a number of years, partly for geostrategic reasons, partly economic reasons, because the North tends to have a different relationship with Europe and Mediterranean countries. But the US recognizes that this is an artificial division, and it's actually wrong, because Africa has never seen itself as a sub-Saharan. We have always understood ourselves to be one continent since we created the OAU in 1963, 64. And now with the AFCFTA, we are firmly convinced that the continent should be united. Now, as I said, the US is very keen and a watcher of China. It's observing China. And what it's observing, so this data is also from the US. I've taken the data straight from the US. The US says that China has surpassed it as a player in Africa. It says that the investments and trade from China to Africa has increased, making China a larger trading partner. China exports or trades, its total trade is 4 times more than the US, but also its investment in Africa is now increasing rapidly, and its FDI is about twice that of the United States. And China is also a big lender into the US. So clearly, this is high up on the agenda of the United States. Now, what should we do?
Sorry, I'm going to need to disturb you. I can give you a minute to just wrap up quickly.
Okay, I'm on just 3 slides. So my recommendations are, we should call for a 10-year extension of AGOA. We should increase the accumulation of between countries, so allowing countries to increase their trade, their industrial activities between each other, and then export into the US. I also think that the United States should negotiate with the continent as a whole, with the AFCFTA. They should increase, or rather they should make their rules of origin more flexible. They should also, as Saul, I think, said, increase the number of products that are excluded from AGOA into AGOA. They should remove some of these duties they have on our steel and aluminium. And they should ensure that they treat Africa as one continent, working with the AFCFTA. And they should, as Tanya said, they should be supporting industrialization. And one way they can do that is by supporting the development of regional value chains on the African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am not going to take questions at the moment. We're running out of time. So I think let's take the last presentation and we can all ask all the questions at the end. Malusi, please come give us insights from the DTIC.
Good morning. And while I still get myself sorted, let me greet the moderator and also greet Ambassador Professor Ismail, who I've seen in a long time, and also greet my fellow panelists. And also just allow me to say all protocol observed. But before I say that, let me also acknowledge to my three colleagues are here, Moloko and Shonisani, and also colleagues from the embassy are here. So greetings to everyone. So I think mine, I'll try to be very short. I think the presentations have covered a number of issues that I would have liked to cover, but I think they've also provided a good background to allow me to go straight to the issues or where we are. And I've structured my notes today to address four things. One will be the renewal of AGOA beyond 2025 and the issues of eligibility. And the other one will be the issue of the timing of the AGOA renewal. The third issue will be around the utilization of AGOA. And the fourth issue will be around how AGOA can support the AFCFTA and also can support the regional value chains. I think these are issues that have been discussed before, so I will try to be very quick where other issues have been covered. In terms of the AGOA renewal, I think it has been said that there is a bipartisan, bicameral support for renewal of AGOA. And we even saw during the AGOA forum that amongst the labor participant, business, civil society, and governments, both from AGOA eligible countries and also from the US, there was a consensus for the renewal of AGOA. We saw the US administration releasing some statements before, even from Congress, which were calling for AGOA renewal. So I think just to fast forward into my, to save time, we've seen since then, there have been legislations that were introduced in Congress, first by Senator Kennedy. For that point of saying bipartisan, I would say Republican from Louisiana, and also another legislation introduced by Senator Coons, who is a Democrat from Delaware, and also Senator Rich, who's also both from the Foreign Relations Committee. And I think the bills, as Professor Ismail have said, the bills are in line with the recommendations from the African Ministers of Trade that were calling for at least renewal of AGOA for at least 10 years. The Kennedy bill is calling for 20 years, and also the Rich Coons bill is calling for a minimum of 10 years, 16 years. So I think there is that issue that addresses. I think in the earlier paper that was released by Senator Coons in November, there was a mention of an out-of-cycle review for South Africa, but we saw in the bill that was released later that particular part has been removed. But I think we saw also in that bill that there is also an issue that has to do with allowing Congress to bring out-of-cycle reviews. Another issue that is of importance to us from the African continent is also the issue of, if you look at the GSP eligibility criteria, AGOA eligibility criteria, it talks that countries that have reached high income status will be removed from AGOA. And one of those countries was Mauritius, because before COVID, it was almost or at that level of a high income. But I think from the African side, we said to build this regional value chains and implement AGOA, we need to have all countries there. So we saw the bills also addressing that particular element. The other one which has also been addressed and also which we are also calling for from what the African ministers also spoke to, which is also what Professor Ismail spoke to, is also the issue of allowing for accumulation in terms of the rules of origin, the countries that with the countries that are in North Africa to also be part of the accumulation. I think that we saw the bills also calling for that, because in terms of the study that was done by the US International Trade Administration, it has illustrated those regional value chains on clothing and textile between Mauritius and Madagascar. But also our own NAMSA here in South Africa have done some work on the automotive, illustrating various supply chains. So I think this is just to say that the bills that are currently before Congress, in large, a lot of issues are in line with African ministers of trade, when they met in Johannesburg last year, recommended, being extension of AGOA for minimum of 10 years. The issue of that countries that have reached high income status should not be graduated, and also the issue of accumulation. There are other recommendations, including what Ambassador Ismail have spoken about in terms of the removal of some of the barriers or issues that affect utilizations. In terms of the timing, I think the ministers were quite clear that they have encouraged Congress to consider renewing AGOA early in 2024 or latest by September 2025. Just to be exact, this month we are 15 months away from the expiry of AGOA unless it is renewed, and we continue to see our ambassadors in Washington engaging with Congress and making submissions for AGOA to be renewed as soon as possible. I think this we said because it will allow for certainty and predictability in the markets, and as both buyers and investors, they make their sourcing and investment decisions few years in advance. So it's quite important that we get AGOA renewed as soon as possible. So we have seen some indications that AGOA may be renewed. Some are saying AGOA will be renewed before the next AGOA forum, which is in probably 3 or 5 weeks. Not sure that will happen, and others are saying by calendar year. So there are a number of timetables being mentioned, but I think what is worth mentioning is that there are also 2 other important legislations that are before US Congress. The other 2 being GSP. GSP, as you'll recall, has expired in December 2020, but for AGOA countries, the legislation has made sure that AGOA the GSP for AGOA countries doesn't expire. It will expire at the same time as AGOA. And there is also Trade Adjustment Assistance Act that also, I think, expired in the end of June 2020. So those are the legislations that I'm not saying they've been linked to the renewal of AGOA, but they're also being considered. But from our side, the main interest has been on the renewal of AGOA. I think now we can say before September 2024. Just to touch on the issue of utilization, I think Sol have touched on this issue of utilizations. So I think for us, Sol, from what is important for us is not necessarily the biggest users of AGOA, is that any cent or dollar that's spent in the African continent is going to create jobs. We have seen currently out of the 35 in 2022, 6 countries did not record any AGOA exports, including Botswana that I'll speak to, while 5 countries have exported less than 100,000 and others have probably exported more. But what you'll see is that any of those exports are quite important for those economies. And we believe that all countries have to start somewhere. So although they may be, in terms of countries, maybe have utilized less, but there is at least they are picking up. And that is important, that we need to build up on that in terms of utilizations. And also in terms of the biggest users of AGOA, what is important is also the issue of regional value chains. We look at South Africa, the automotive regional value chains, and as TIPS in 2014 have done a study that also showed the regional value chains on textiles and clothing in terms of Lesotho, Eswatini, and South Africa on textiles and clothing. Also with Madagascar, which is one of the beneficiaries, there is also regional value chains have formed there. So I think if you look at the biggest users of AGOA and you look at the regional value chains, it's quite important that there is a mix, because if you look at Botswana, they are not recording any AGOA exports, but they are exporting wire harnesses to South Africa, which gets put in cars and exported to this. Those exports are not recorded under AGOA. So hence the issues of regional value chains are quite important. I would have wanted to add some other thing, but because of time, I think let him just move to the final point that we also wanted to make, that around the issue of AGOA complementing and supporting the implementation of the ACFTA and the creation of regional value chains. And I think Ambassador Ismail have spoken about the regional value chains that have been identified under the ACFTA or in the African continent. So I think what we are saying is as African countries trade in goods, products in their production process for AGOA, as we trade together, we exchange inputs, and that will assist in terms of intra-Africa trade. But some of the products are being used as inputs for export for products that are finally being exported to the US. And I think it's an area that still needs further research and in terms of this value chains, in terms of how AGOA can complement the AFF-CFTA and vice versa on how ACFTA can support AGOA exports. And the ACFTA Secretariat has presented some ideas on this topic last week in the AGOA midterm review, and we look forward to receiving further inputs from the Secretariat on how AGOA can complement the ACFTA. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation. Thanks, colleagues, for sticking with us. So I would like to let's start with 2 rounds of questions. So the first 3 questions I'm going to ask are going to come from the people online. We'll take answers from the panelists, and then we'll ask another 3 questions from the room. So the first question we have here is just around the scope of some of the exports under AGOA, which is, does it include mining equipment and consumables manufactured in South Africa? I think part of that question would have been answered during Saul's presentation, but we can hear the answer from that question as well. And then the other question is around some of the factors that might enable participation in AGOA. So are there any other criteria that are looked at besides price? So around sustainability, for example. And I think that's an important question considering the impact of CBAM, for example. If South Africa is going to start manufacturing EVs, would that be beneficial for South African exports into the US? If we don't manufacture EVs, what does that mean for, exports to the US, which right now they don't have a CBAM situation, but obviously our other actual big market for auto exports is not the US, it's the EU. So what are the implications there? And then I think one last important question from online, which we've sort of scattered around, is what is actually the incentive we have here for renewing AGOA if the actual benefits overall is what did the person say, around 1% of total exports, for example? What is the actual benefit for South Africa? And I would like to emphasize that question particularly. We had earlier around, the one country being taken out because of the ban on secondhand clothing. Now, what are the implications of that if a country can be taken out because of that? And here we are trying to, improve our textiles industry and export to the US. And then the US is saying, can we get our secondhand clothes into the African market? Is that really something that is not counter to what we're trying to do here? So I think let's take answers for those questions, and then we can take questions from the room. So would you like to start, Javed?
Thanks. Let me start with the last one. And then I can also ask Faisal to talk about chicken, beef, and pork. But I suppose the benefits to reviewing come in a number of different forms. So it does give access to a market. It enables increased exports of specific products. But and I did highlight this under the risks. There are risks because of the way it's structured that you can be taken out or put through a out of cycle review. So at all points, if that happens, there is a negotiation that needs to take place. Is it worthwhile for the country to continue or not? For South Africa, there was tough negotiations. Faisal spent 18 months of his life in those negotiations. So there are issues that come up in that issue. For Rwanda, it was obviously better to exit than accept the secondhand clothing because they want to build their own clothing and textile industry. So there's always going to be trade-offs, and each country would need to evaluate that. but one of the things is the structure of AGOA and how it's open to lobbying. That might be one of the technical things that needs to be adjusted in how AGOA is structured going forward. But because it's a unilateral measure and it is tied to US policy, if countries fall foul of that, the US says we don't want that country to be benefiting from access to our market. So it's going to be an ongoing debate. In terms of the products that are included, there is a list. It's on the USTR website. I think Basil referred to it. In our report, we do reference it. So the specific products are all itemized. It's very easy to access. The sustainability issues, I'll leave to others to answer.
I just want to raise one point in terms of an incentive to renew, and that relates to, it does help address inequality. So inequality in South Africa is driven largely by high levels of unemployment, and AGOA supports 267,000 odd jobs. So it is important for the country as a whole, and by addressing inequality, one addresses stability in the region.
No, thank you very much for the questions. On the last one, I think just to correct is that on the second-hand clothing, Rwanda has not been removed. What it had is their textile and clothing exports benefits were suspended because under the AGOA legislation, the USTR or the US have three options. One is termination, suspension, and so on. So it was not terminated, but it was suspended. And on the issue of environment, sustainability, I think we need to separate between exporting and eligibility criteria. Currently, environment is not one of the eligibility criteria in terms of AGOA. So CBAM doesn't come into the eligibility. But in terms of exporting, if you want to make your products very attractive and so on, you get wines, there are those kind of sustainability that comes in. So it's not only on autos in terms of the critical minerals, but it's also on other products in terms of how you position your products and so on. So I think those are the questions that I would like to ask, but I'm sure Ambassador Ismail can also add. Thank you.
Prof, would you like to answer?
Yes, I'd just like to perhaps make 3 points. The first is that, well, I think the US is wise not to pursue a FTA, but we're not out of the woods because they are talking to Kenya, and we don't know where that discussion is going to go. But if there is a FTA with Kenya, this will undermine the African, AFCFTA attempt to integrate the continent. It will create a sort of back door into the continent, and this would not be very helpful. Why I say they're wise not to do it, because the Europeans have not been that wise, and we know that EPAs have really been disastrous for most African countries, and because they're totally inequitable. If you take the case of many of the LDCs, 34 African countries are LDCs. In a free trade agreement, it means they must, renounce their current access, which they get into OECD countries, duty-free, quota-free market access. And in exchange, they must allow for reciprocal free trade in a situation where, as you look at the data, you see that most African countries, almost half of Africa, doesn't export more than $100 million. And some, as Malusi has indicated, even export less than that. So in that context, African countries will have very little to gain from a free trade arrangement with the United States. Now, the second point is that, AGOA, nevertheless, is not free. It's not free. As we know, we negotiated and we had to provide access in chicken, for example, but also we had to address issues of SBS in beef and in pork, making it easier for the United States to export into our market. And of course, the policy discussion that they did create as a result of putting us on this out-of-cycle review, it opened a discourse about all our policies, whether it was intellectual property rights, investment, other issues of interest to the United States in legislation that we were passing, and allowing the US businesses to use their pressure to ensure that these rules were more amenable to them and their interests in our country. Similarly, an out-of-cycle review for other African countries can do the same. And so we need to understand that it's not free. AGOA, as it stands, is not free. There is a cost. So we will have to weigh the benefits and the costs when we see the final product and we see what they do. Now, one of the things that I raised in the negotiation, but also in some of the articles I've written about this, is that the current legislation, the AGOA legislation, creates attrition, which is not good for the United States. So if you take the case of the secondhand clothing industry, most US observers did not like what happened in East because it allowed for a single exporting secondhand clothes into East Africa to petition the United States and then require the US USTR to initiate the process, an out-of-cycle review, and then to pressurize the countries to remove the ban on secondhand clothing, which was a very rational decision they made in East Africa because they wanted to stimulate domestic production of apparel. So in a case like this, it creates attrition. It wasn't good what they did in the case of Rwanda. And, therefore, it's not in the interest of the United States to retain such a provision in the new legislation that is going to be introduced in the new relationship. So I would strongly suggest that such, pieces of legislation should be carefully scrutinized by the United States as it decides on the new AGOA Plus, whatever it is, the new trade and investment agreement that will ensue from here. Thank you.
Thanks. So I hope colleagues online, you were answered on the questions around the eligibility criteria, but we will also share the presentations and you can follow those links as well around the products. Any questions in the room? 1, 2, 3. Can we please pass the mic?
Hello, my name is Akile. I'm an intern at TIPS. Tanya, the question around the one-stop shop. So Malusi, you haven't answered that question. I'd like to hear the government's response to that interesting proposition. And then secondly, Tanya mentioned a lady dealing with honey wanted to penetrate the US market. So what recourse does that type of person have? I asked this on the back of a conversation I attended a panel discussion around the cosmetics where one lady had her problem was that she had been creative enough to create a product, a skin care product, it arose out of a problem that her kid faced. A kid was subjected to acne spectrum. So she created a product dealing with that. And then there's a company in the UK that stole that idea and even stole, I think, even the branding. So she was posing a question to the panelist around the question of intellectual property as well as propriety. Now, the response that she was getting, she kept getting advice around law firms that deal with intellectual property. So for a person like that who's small scale, who'd obviously have to face the onerous burdens, of litigation, what type of recourse would that person have? So, and wouldn't those factors be deterrents for small scale players to enter any field? Thanks.
Pass it to Simba and then we can move it up front.
Thank you. My name is Simba Rashe. From TIPS. I think Sakil have stolen my question on the one-stop shop from Tanya. We have seen the impacts that the AGOA is made. My question is with regards to SMMEs and a just transition perspective. The elimination of tariffs is welcomed, but one of the silent barriers that we often see is lack of information. Like I always say, in Africa, we do have poverty of information. So we would see that most SMMEs are not aware of these opportunities and how to go about utilizing these opportunities that are there. I liked the idea of one-stop shop, but if the AGOA is to be renewed, I want to hear from the DTIC perspective, what information programs are there to create awareness about these opportunities to SMMEs as we move towards a just transition? Thank you.
Cynthia, up front.
Yes, thank you, Andrew from the US Embassy. We just had the midterm review, Melissa, that you mentioned. We have the annual eligibility hearing coming up on Friday, and we're looking ahead to the AGOA forum next month, both from the perspective of trade ministers or South Africa, but also from civil society. What are the top goals for the forum next month, or the types of discussions that you want to put forward in that forum?
Cool. Charles, online, are you asking a question on anti-dumping?
Oh, yes. I'm Charles Touré. I'm a doctoral student from the University of... yeah. Of course, we are quite aware a developing country has been constrained.
Let me ask the question. There was a question online and then we can just take answers. Yeah, he sent it. I think it's the same question. So there's a question around how to deal with the problem of dumping activities, especially in light of wanting to protect infant industries. I think we can start taking answers. Let's start with Malusi, please, and then we'll move on. Sorry, colleagues, can we just have maybe 5-10 minutes extra to address these issues?
No, thank you for the questions, and I'll be very short. I think on the one-stop shop, we do have an export desk within our export branch of the DTIC. And we do also have a guide on how to use AGOA, which has a number of contact details. And as I've said, we do have colleagues here in the Americas desk that have worked on AGOA for a lot of years. So they do. So if you have any questions, Muluku, Shonisane and Fundi are here, but I think what as government normally we don't do very well is to have some of this information online where people can access it. So I think the guideline will try as soon as possible to put it on the DTI website. We also have last year done a number of road shows to Limpopo, to Gauteng, to to Durban, and I think we also wanted to do some also to other provinces. So these are some of how we take the information to SMEs and also so I think we'll do most of this. These days with technology, we can do more. So in this AGOA roadshows, we include the likes of DALRAD, the Department of Small Business Development, we include SARS, we include other agencies depending on the sector that we are targeting for that particular province. So we are as much as inclusive as possible. I think on the issue of IP, I wish I can provide a better advice than that, but I think the first one is issues around registrations, and from there, if there is any violation, I think the only matter you can take up currently is through this legal means. So I think I wish I can, on the issue of dumping, I think we do have our International Trade Administration commission, ITEC, that if there is a company that feels like it is being injured or there is a dumping or excess imports, they can make a petition and there will be an investigation and a ruling, a determination that will be sent to the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition to make the final decision. So there is a legislated process on how to deal with the matters around dumping. Thank you.
I just want to address a few small issues. The issue of when companies come to us and say they've got a problem, what recourse is there? Certainly, DTRC is in a good position to help where it can. As Labour, we have found DTRC highly responsive to requests to assist on a range of issues. So the idea of the one-stop shop would just make it much easier and quicker to get through to DTRC so that we can access their expertise. But a second way to help promote AGOA and exports is through the trade unions. So for example, the Clothing and Textile Union in South Africa knows AGOA well. There are a lot of companies in that sector that are exporting under AGOA. What it means is that where they're organizing in other companies or companies that are not exporting and they need to grow their markets, it's one of the ideas the union can put forward for the companies to consider. And the union can then speak to the positive impacts that it's seen on the ground. In terms of having civil society at the next AGOA forum and what would be the key issues, I think the key issues still would be how do we create employment? How do we make sure that that employment is decent work? How do we enforce the labor clauses? And lastly, how do we promote regional integration and employment?
Thanks. Okay. A lot of the issues I think have been touched on already. One of the things around the just transition and issues related to that, I think it's a complex space because there's different legislation that deals with those things. You've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which prioritizes certain products in the US market and other legislation. But in time, we will fully expect to see the US coming with its own CBAM, which does put pressure on South Africa to decarbonize. Our biggest area of decarbonization, as we know, is electricity provision. So I think those are going to become increasingly important. And a lot of the big manufacturers, because of what's happening with the EU and now with the UK coming, they're on a path to look at renewables or negotiating with Eskom around the provision of renewables to their operations. Is Faisal back on yet?
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay, so Faisal will type his remarks. And then I think just to add to top issues, I suppose it's around some of the technical issues that Faisal raised on access, and how the out of cycle reviews work. So things around that, so that it's not just open to what we've seen. So it gives proper certainty around longevity of AGOA and enables companies to invest for that long term. I think that's been really important, and to avoid some of what Faisal refers to as attrition. That would be from my side. Thanks.
Okay. Do we have scope for one more question, or should we close? Okay, cool. Thanks, colleagues, for joining us for today's development dialogue. I don't know if the panelists maybe want to say one thing or two. Otherwise, we can.
Can we read out what was put in the chat?
Is it up already? No, not yet. Okay, please. Let's.
I don't.
No, I think for me is just to say we remain available. We'll try as much as we can to make the information on AGOA utilization assistance available or online as soon as possible. This is not only for AGOA, but it's also for all the trade agreements that South Africa have signed. All of them are trying to get them online as soon as possible. So, and also the contact details, like now on the ACFTA, if you go to the detail website, you may not find the information. So we are trying to get all the agreement, the contact persons, all of that information online as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nothing? We're good. Okay, cool. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us. We look forward to engaging with you more in future when we have one of these again. That is it for the day. There's still some food at the back. Thank you once again for joining us. Have a good day.